Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and I'm very happy to have my three roundtable guests of Helms, Menno Henselmans, and Mike Israetel, and they're all great to be here as well. And we've just been talking off air how they all just produce cookie cutter programs and don't individualize. But this obviously is not the case, and individualization for hypertrophy is actually quite important, I feel, and for bodybuilders, and I think just for yourself in general, because a lot of people talk about, oh, this person swears by this, so it must work for everyone, or that the science says this, so again, it must work for everyone. And I think as people are becoming more aware of science, we're now becoming more aware of also the fact that there's a bell curve. There's people at one end, there's people at the other end, and there's people in the middle. And so I wanted to talk to each of these guys about individualization and why it's such an important thing, and how to actually, and how they apply it to their own clients. So I think first of all, it's important to talk about the different aspects of individualization, or the different things that could impact it. So environment and genetics. And I know we've spoken about genetics before with Mike and Greg Nichols. And I don't know if, Mike, you want to talk about the genetic elements that might influence kind of why someone might be a bit different, and that impacting things.
Yeah, totally. Sure. So, genetics are a big deal, and the research directly on the genetic relationships between muscle growth and a variety of other training variables and lifestyle variables isn't vast, but I will tell you that the research on the genetic effects on other variables that we would usually be inclined to consider as much more environmental is vast and highly impressive. So, for example, general intelligence is something like 30% heritable. So genetics is 30% responsible when children are very young. When they become adolescents, it's something like 50% heritable. And when something, in adulthood, especially mid-adulthood, intellectual prime, genetics predicts intelligence with heritabilities of about 0.8 to 0.9, which is really obscene when you think about it. But what that really means is that as you grow into the person you were supposed to be as an adult genetically, variations that you had away from the mean as a kid tend to stabilize, and you sort of become who you were supposed to be in some sense. So if you were like a really gifted kid, but your parents weren't so gifted, there's a pretty decent chance you're not going to be super gifted when you're an adult. If you were really slow to catch on as a kid, and your parents are both super sharp, there's a pretty decent chance that you actually will get sharper as you get older, more so than age alone would predict, and you start to catch on a bit faster and eventually sort of rise to the expectation. These are all averages. But just to point that out, if something so obviously sociologically related and measured as intelligence can be so heritable, where does that leave something like muscle growth, which is a much more straightforward physiological process? The answer is very, very heritable. And that does not mean that environment doesn't matter, because then nobody would train with weights. It would just be or whatever muscularity you were, as Leneke seems to think. Anyway, I'm just sorry, I'm having a stroke again. So in any case, the degree to which you respond to a weight training program, for example, for hypertrophy, is considerably highly genetically dependent, and the degree with which you recover, the speed with which you recover, is highly genetically dependent. The body shape you end up having, and thus the kinds of exercises you prefer / the ones that tend to hurt you a little bit more, is very genetically dependent. So there's muscle insertion points and things like that. Muscle shapes are also super genetically dependent. So a lot of training ends up being figuring out, by sort of more trial and error than anything, maybe some logic as well, what your genotype is, and fitting the right kind of training to that. So just a really quick example, and I'll throw it to the other guys. If you tend to be somebody that is more fast twitch dominant on average, right, average muscularity, and you tend to just have not the greatest recoverability genetics, then you will soon find out that very high volume training is just not for you. And you will eventually settle into an average of a lower volume training and making sure you stay on top of your recovery like crazy. On the other hand, somebody that's more slow twitch dominant on average and also has a lot of really good recoverability, they're going to probably find their best growth with training volumes that look like death to everybody else, and they can get away with not getting super crazy sleep or tons of meals and still come in and hammer the weight. So for folks like that, advice like you got to fucking suffer, brother, and put in the work is going to just resound with them much more, where the other folks are going to discover more of a minimalist approach to training, and that's going to resound with them. Just really quick, a lot of times when you see people debate on social media about like, you know, man, I tried German volume training, it sucks and it's really stupid, and someone else will like, well, I got great results from it. A lot of that's just genetics, and there's really no one program that works the best, but there's a sliding scale on volume, frequency, intensity, and all that, and you got to find kind of the areas in which you benefit the most, and everyone else does something different. That's okay, because you can either figure out what you're doing or bang your head against the wall doing some other shit that works better for other people.
No, definitely, and I think everyone can relate to that in that they maybe have trained with a training partner before, and maybe they haven't seen as good results as them, or on a certain progress, they haven't progressed at the same rate as them. I don't know if Menno, you've had many experiences with some of your clients where you have maybe found that you'd had to program quite differently for them, and how you came across that discovery in terms of like practical application. If you've ever had, I guess a lot of people listening to this who maybe haven't had coaches might just fall into programs and just keep going thinking that that's kind of quote unquote optimal for them. And I know a big part of your training is to try and find that optimal rate of development for the person, how you go about discovering that for the person.
Mm-hmm. Very, very objectively. First though, because I think it's good to Mike, do you know if there's actually research on the heritability factor of muscular potential? Probably really hard to do.
Yeah, so some of the research that was originally done in the Minnesota Twin studies was on strength and muscularity, but those are the roughest measures you could imagine. The sample sizes are really big, but it's not something that you would consider sports science research. It's like how a psychologist would approach measuring physical qualities. So they think there's some other stuff they've done with particular genotypes, but that's not exactly a holistic approach to, they'll test various genes and be like, oh, these are predictive of muscle growth, but that's a pin in the haystack sort of approach. I'm not familiar with any really good quality, high sample size review of like just pure heritability studies in muscular responses.
Yeah,
also,
I mean,
just to tack this on, I even think that when you do see those core studies that Mike might be alluding to, they're always looking at baseline. So just how much muscularity and strength do you have, which actually doesn't seem to relate at all to how much someone can grow. The percentage change they can make is actually not related to their initial starting line. So looking jacked without lifting doesn't necessarily mean you're going to look way more jacked if you start lifting weights, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to say. Because if you have research on the heritability factors, what you need is you need to look at a sample size of people who have reached their genetic potential, which is very hard to first determine, and then second, even if you could determine it, find those individuals and enough of them. So, but as a reference though, we do have research on the heritability.
Couldn't we just take anyone on Instagram who's getting claimed as a fake natty and like that's pretty much it right there, right?
Yeah.
Just kidding.
But if we look at research on the heritability factor of strength, there was a really good review on that from a few years ago, and it was 0.5, which means strength, hand grip strength, I think they used, which in my experience is actually a pretty good proxy. If there's such a thing as like a strength measure you could do in an untrained individual and test, are these guys going to make it in powerlifting? Hand grip strength would be pretty good, I would say, insofar as you could tell anything, based on their untrained individual. And it was 0.5, so that's 0.5 is actually the average in everything, sort of, in research and heritability factors, which is like, it's environmental, it's genetic. And that estimate would go down considerably if we factor in that it's 0.5 for the baseline, and then we also have all room for strength development with strength training. So in that light, it would actually seem that the heritability factor of strength, and if we, for the sake of argument, assume that strength and muscle growth have the same heritability, probably muscle growth might be a bit more determined genetically than strength, because you also have the neural factors that are quite adaptive compared to muscle tissue. But let's say for our sake of argument, it's the same. It would be below 0.5, which would mean that, compared to everything else in life that has a genetic component, your personality, whatever, it's actually not that strongly genetically determined. So not as strongly as IQ, for example. So in that respect, I think it's not too, I don't want to be too pessimistic about it, but genetics obviously do matter a lot. To the original question, have I coached individuals that really responded very differently to the original program? It's definitely not like every individual needs a completely different approach. I think the program that I start with, and I try to individualize it based on what I know, their genetic indicators. I look at their frame size, how advanced they are. That's a really big one. If they're male, female, that's another really big one. Age, of course, if they're 50 plus or younger. But usually it's within the ballpark. So it's pretty rare that you have an individual and you would get a program like that that's supposed to be optimal given what we know of the individual, and they end up completely or reacting to something completely different. But it's definitely the case that some individuals in particular need a lot of tweaking. And basically, I think there are two really cool studies on this. They're actually pretty amazing, really, if you ask me. There's Bevan et al. From 2008, and they looked at a bunch of rugby players, and then they put them on 4 different programs, which were 5 sets of 15, 4 sets of 10, 3 sets of 5, and 3 sets of 5 with like low intensity. So it was like pure power, traditional power, strength, endurance, hypertrophy workouts, those 4. And they first looked with a test workout, which one of those produced the highest salivary testosterone level. So they put a stick in their mouth, looked at their testosterone level, and saw which one of those test workouts they respond best to based on their testosterone response. And then they classified them into either the best program or the worst program. So they saw, okay, this guy actually gets like usually insanely masculine from power workout and responds really, really crappily, instantly grows man boobs to the endurance workout. And they actually had them do those programs. And unfortunately, they didn't measure muscle growth, but they did measure body weight and strength. And it was a radical difference in how they responded. So some people actually basically maintained, some people even seem to lose gains on the worst program. And on the best program, they made great development. So that's, I think, the measure of salivary testosterone has been contested in a lot of research. But it's very interesting that you get such a difference in response. And based on at least a measure like that, like salivary testosterone, you can classify people into responding very differently to different programs. So there is definitely merit to individualization. The other study is, actually I think it's older. I think it's 2003, maybe 13. Coaglu et al., or however you pronounce it. They looked at ACE gene and then had the different individuals based on their ACE gene, like II or DD, basically makes you more like, it corresponds a lot to fast twitch, slow twitch in terms of genotype. So II is like super endurance oriented. And they actually found that the people with the II gene that are supposedly endurance oriented actually seem to respond better to higher reps and more volume. Whereas the people with the DD phenotype, where it's supposed to be like fast twitch, responded better to, or did not respond better to the higher volume and did respond better to the higher intensity. So that corresponds with, at least anecdotally, if you look at a book I really like about this, is The Sports Gene. And he goes over like a lot of research on, or anecdotes, it's mostly a compilation of anecdotes of high-level sprinters. And they actually test the fiber types of these guys. And they indeed found that like recovery capacity was also strongly limited to fiber type. So, these are outliers. Because if you're a high-level sprinter, then you're probably like super fast twitch, and most people do not vary that much in muscle fiber type at all. But the general point is that it definitely matters, and there are factors that can predict whether we respond better to higher volume, lower volume, maybe even higher reps, lower reps. But volume is probably one of the key ones. And then the strategy for us as coaches, the difficulty is finding out what predicts if a certain individual will respond well to high volume or low volume. So one of the few things I'm pretty confident about in that it says something is work capacity. So if I look at my clients and I see that they have really good work capacity, which means their reps go like 8, 8, 7, 7, in spite of me saying, okay, train to failure or 1 rep to failure. And I know that they're actually training hard because that's another factor you need to take into account as a coach. And then usually they can handle more volume, and you really see that women have higher work capacity and can handle more volume as well compared to men. Whereas if you see someone reps go like mine, they go like 12, 6, 3 if I squat, balls out, then doesn't really respond well to adding in more volume. And it makes sense if you just look at, even if it's maybe the only reason it matters is because it's just the total volume matters for growth. And if I do a 4th set of squats in a workout, I'm going to be doing 2 extra reps. Well, that's a pretty trivial increase in volume. So it might be just that is the reason I don't respond to it, because I don't really add much volume if I do another set.
No, I'm glad you brought in the area of how do we as trainees or as coaches think about these things, because obviously we can't test someone's testosterone in their saliva and things like this. So it's nice that you've kind of got that, how do they do across sets? And when I think about this and I think about Mike's principles of like maximum recoverable volume and working through this, I know that's one of the things you take into consideration is like performance across sets. If you're performing well, you're feeling well recovered, then potentially you can do more volume to work towards that. Is that kind of the right sort of thing, Mike?
Yeah. So what Menno is looking at is intra-session performance. I think that is potentially a very, very brilliant way to go about things. I tend to look at session-to-session decrements in performance. If you do a certain volume and then you increase the volume a little bit like you normally would next week and you're hunky-dory and still hitting all predicted reps and sets, then you're good to go. If you shit the bed, you might be just a chance event. Might be that you're doing too much. If you consider the real sort of way to go about figuring out how much you can tolerate and like Eric has fucked me in the ass for, it doesn't mean you need to train there all the time. It's the real way to figure that out is if you consistently hit a wall at a certain amount of work, mesocycle after mesocycle, then they just probably in excess of your general ability to recover. It's probably a dumb idea to keep doing that. People get man, I'm sure you guys have better stories than me about this. But do you guys ever have people being like, yeah, man, I tried Smolov again and it fucking crushed me again. Like, you dumb motherfucker. Why are you trying that shit for the 5th time? Like, do you think something magical is going to happen?
Yes.
And it just, at some point it just works and they're like, oh, sweet. So it's one of those, like, if you keep track of your training numbers, you really do know when you're under recovered. And that comes down to a lot of honesty. One quick thing that I have to point out, in response to Menno's genetics stuff, very, very right on. I will say that the pertinent question is not the genetic variation between people who do not train or have yet to train and people who are training. The real big question is, given that you give folks a generally decent hard training program, what is then going to be the influence of every other variable versus their genetics? I tend to find in my experience that if you give people a decent program, you will see that genetics accounts for much of the rest of the variation in response, granted that they also consume adequate food. So basically, if someone comes to me and says, look, I've been doing this program like 5x5 or some shit like that with a bit of assistance work, I'm eating my calories, and they're not bullshitting you or whatever. I'm eating calories, I'm eating protein, and I'm just not getting amazing results. Man, I just got to be honest, you probably don't have amazing genetics, and the Mr. Olympia is not for you. All the folks that have gotten enormous are the kinds have been like, so I did 5x5 for 6 months and ate food, and I gained 40 kilos of muscle, and now I can't walk or some shit. Like Chad Wesley Smith gained like 40 kilos during high school, just lifting and eating. And you're like, what? Like, just boom, it just happened. And I tend to find that, especially at the extremes, and I'd love to get you guys' input on this, folks that are really super hard gainers, even though their nutrition and training is pretty good, I just don't think there's a big thing over the rainbow for those folks. Like, if just one thing fucking clicks, they're just going to have these massive gains. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
No, I think if you click everything into place, they can make gains. That's been my experience. Like, they
gains,
become
period. Some kind of
non-responder, but that's about as good as it might get for people who really, really have a bad card dealt. So,
yeah.
Menno, what do you think?
I usually say, like, if you put someone on what supposedly is a scientific optimal program, then I often use the rule of thumb: this will provide at least 80% of your results for 80% of individuals. So it's like double Pareto, and because there will be some outliers, and there will be a lot of people where you can fine tune, but there are also a lot of people where it will just be around optimal.
Perfect. And I think I want to definitely talk about, obviously we talked a lot about genetics. I'd love to talk about environment. And I know, Eric, you guys on the 3DMJ podcast, you've talked about kind of case studies with clients and things and how much the environment can impact things. And I'd love to get your kind of experience in where you've seen, like, I don't know, you might have had some clients who are an online coach themselves and they have lots of control of their time versus maybe someone is like a dad and works a 9-to-5 job, and the impact that makes on kind of having to individualize on that basis.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So Steve, I think it's really important to point out that individualization is not the same thing as genetics, not even close, because like these guys said, you can't do a genetic test with your clients, at least yet. And in our day-to-day practice, I would say the things that we are aware of and have more ability to change are environmental. And they do have large impacts on performance. There's some good research out there from a lot of angles on this. There's some work by Bartholomew that looks at college students and finds that the more negative life experiences they have or stressful events that they report, you see a pretty predictable decrease in their strength gains. Getting less sleep tends to predict poor gains in the gym, poor nutrition, like all the stuff that we focus on as trainers. It's our job: change someone's environment, help them shift their perspective, manipulate their training program and fit it to their lifestyle, is pretty much the bread and butter of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And I think without going too far into that, because that could be, that's like most of what personal training is, if you think about it. I think it's just really important to emphasize that. And there are factors that you can't control an environment, depending on the individual. They might be in a situation in their lives where they have to work at times that are suboptimal for their circadian rhythm, or suboptimal for their eating schedule, or suboptimal for tracking nutrition. Like, I've had clients who are literally traveling salesmen, and they have to work out in a different gym than the last time they were here, like on a regular basis. So some of the tools that are really useful in that, in those situations, are a lot of the auto-regulatory tools that I've tried to bring to light, and others have as well. Having flexible training templates. Actually, Menno would be great to talk about this because he's essentially a traveling fitness person. Like having flexible templates, using RPE, having a flexible mode of selecting exercises, but still having some way to take pretty rigorous notes so you can see where you were last time you were able to do something. Focusing on free weights, since you've pretty much always got access to dumbbells and barbells, and having a good understanding of macronutrition, and having the skill and ability to make a lot of things fit. This is where If It Fits Your Macros becomes very useful, because you may not have control over the type of food you're going to have access to. So you got to get pretty creative. So a lot of that is giving clients tools to be more autonomous, which takes more time, but also pays off much bigger dividends. The clients who have really engaged me with that, and who have allowed me to take a very strong mentorship role and teach them how to be flexible and learn these tools, use RPE, and have a very chaotic life, they tend to be really, really good once their life does settle down. And they've got all these tools that allow them to take a lot more control over their outcomes. So I think, there's so many rabbit holes we could go down, but I would say just acknowledging the fact that many of the things outside of the gym and outside of the kitchen can have bigger impacts in aggregate on your outcomes than the things you do in the gym and the kitchen, believe it or not, sometimes, is important, because then you don't become so siloed in what you focus on. And it's not all just about, ticking my boxes for nutrition training, which I think is important to conceptualize.
Yeah, I think
just
go a minute.
Yeah, like Eric said, sleep. Sleep is so important, it's ridiculous. There was a recent study that I posted on Facebook. I actually emailed the authors to check if the data were legit, because it just seemed absurd. They found that when people went on a diet, a weight loss diet, they were untrained, but you'd expect similar results in trained individuals ratio-wise. And they had them sleep 1 hour less during the midweek, but they actually allowed them to catch up during the weekend as much as they wanted. So they had limited sleep during the weekend. And if you think about this is like most people, right? You suffer 1 hour of sleep deprivation during the midweek, and you catch up as much as you can during the weekend. That resulted in the average ratio of lean to fat mass change going from 80-20 to 20-80. So they went from losing only 20% of lean mass, which is normal. That's like the average in literature, I think, to losing 80% lean. That's just insane. And it was 1 hour difference. And if that was just one study, that would be like, I don't know about that. And I generally don't know about that difference. But a previous study had actually found that sleeping 5.5 hours compared to 8 hours resulted in over 50% less fat loss and over 50% more muscle loss over the course of a weight loss diet, which is also huge. So that's like, I think a quote by Greg Knuckles is really, really apt here. He said at the Epic Fitness Summit, which was years ago, but he said most people have this idea in their head about basically Eric's idea of a pyramid of importance. And most people have this idea that at the top you have, training and nutrition and whatever, and there's debates, is diet more important than training, whatnot. Supplements are probably somewhere a bit below that. And then way at the bottom is, sleep and stress and stuff like, it's important, but it's not really important, right, guys? So actually,
the other way around. Sorry.
No, exactly. That's what Greg said. So if you have that concept, what most people have, in reality, it's like you should probably turn that upside down. So it's actually that factors like sleep and stuff, of course, training volume, energy, balance, those matter enormously. But when it comes to fine tuning, then sleep is probably more important than all of those things. Sleep is more on the level of energy balance, protein intake, and training volume than the fine tuning of training variables. It's huge.
Go on, Mike.
Yeah, I would second that. Dr. James Hoffman from RP, sort of sleep expert and head author of the recovery book. And every time we do a seminar, he hammers this as much as he can. You kind of get this response from most audiences like, yeah, I know, I don't sleep enough. Oh, well, so what about like exactly what rep should I do? Sets of 11 or sets of 12? I was like, you dumb asshole. No, like you miss an hour or two of sleep chronically, like you can forget about reps altogether. And from experience with clients, I must have caught on to this pretty early. I didn't know any of the theoretical stuff behind it, but like I used to train a bunch of like CEOs and shit in Manhattan and New York, and nothing happened to these people. Like training was good, their diets supposedly were diets, and just we couldn't make any fucking progress. My wife is a doctor, and when she's on the residency rotations that are really nuts on sleep, she's a competitive powerlifter, nothing goes well. Like we slow the rate of her decline. That's all we can do. And then when she starts sleeping again, it's like she's summoning like the earth goddess or some shit. She just fucking reps out everything. And you're like, oh my God, look at all these PRs. People I think sometimes just aren't really willing to look at their sleep as a not a negotiable, but as a huge priority. Like, sorry to get on a high horse here, but I will straight up leave whatever event I'm at to get my sleep. Sleep is straight up non-negotiable for me. Like, like at like fitness summits and stuff like that, people will be like, let's go out. And I'm like, oh, yep, nope, go fuck yourselves. I'm going to go sleep. That's it. Yeah, I'm that big of a dick. But it's one of those things, like, it's not even like people are like, oh, it's okay, you'll sleep later. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, that's how important sleep is. I'm not getting 5 hours. It's just out of the question. Like, minimum 8. That's it. I sleep usually 8 to 10 hours a night. I have the most boring fucking life in the entire world. I missed the fireworks yesterday, 4th of July, because I went to sleep before they started. I got to get gains, bro. I had a fucking unbelievable workout today, though, and weigh 260 pounds, so all is well, I guess. I don't know. It's just it's one of those things where people say sleep's important, and it almost sounds pedantic sometimes. Like, oh yeah, like yeah, sleep. It's not yeah. It's like it's the biggest fucking deal in the world. Sorry, real quick while I'm ranting. Last little example. There's a bodybuilder who I follow on Instagram. This is a pro bodybuilder. He's really jacked, and he's like posted an Instagram picture of him like making his food at like 2 a.m. He's like gonna make food. Gonna check some client emails, gonna be up again at 6 a.m. to train clients for 12 hours, and then I train in the evenings. I'm on the way up, baby. No time for sleep. I got to do what it takes to be the best. Sometimes you got to trade it off. And I'm just like, oh my God, like that is just, it's the craziest thing you could ever imagine somebody saying. And he's totally not in the know. He's just going to find out the hard way, I guess.
Yeah.
I think I was just going to say, I think it's really important that you guys have brought this up, because what we've kind of come to is a discussion of, yes, there's many genetic variables, but you can't have a great test for that. We have some great baseline training programs which you can auto-regulate towards finding what works for you. But there's so many people who are quick to blame their training program when they haven't got things like sleep in place, they haven't got their nutrition in place. And it's so frustrating as a coach to see that with a client and be like, I can't make you sleep. And it's good for the listeners to hear that if they are struggling with their program, have a serious talk with yourself. Are you getting everything else that you need to in place? But yeah, go ahead, Menno. I know you had something to say.
Yeah, on that note, I push my clients pretty hard. Most people that come to me, like I coach people that are very serious. So quite a lot of my clients worry at some point if they're overtraining or not. And for one, if they're making good progress, you're not overtraining. But the first thing I always ask, which usually it's not overtraining, it's not the results that they're worried about, it's fatigue. And always the first thing I ask is, how much are you sleeping? Because many people think, oh, I'm fatigued because I did 4 sets of biceps work instead of 3 sets that I did the weeks before. Now I'm fatigued. Instead of, well, you didn't sleep good that night, so that's why you're fatigued. And sleep deprivation kind of makes you tired. So it's huge. For me, the turning point was actually my father, because I had insomnia, really, really bad insomnia throughout adolescence. And at some point, my father said, if you put an ounce of dedication that you put into your training and diet, into properly organizing your sleep, into actually doing that, you would not have insomnia anymore. And that really hit home with me. And since then, basically, I've been good. And I've got my biorhythm as artificial as possible, basically. So I use melatonin, light therapy, because I do have a sleep disorder. But if I do all that, then it's good. I sleep 9 hours a night. I'm kind of like Mike. I don't sacrifice sleep for anything. Some international flights, it's inevitable. But that's pretty much it. Anything else, we'll have to get out of the way for sleep. So it's not that some things are not worth it. It's just that you're a completely different person. Speaking from vast experience as being chronically sleep deprived, it's literally like you're a different person if you're well rested versus chronically sleep deprived.
I don't know if I know, Eric, you muted Mike. I don't know if Mike's become unmuted. Oh, he keeps
I can toggle it. It's fucking rude though. It says Eric muted Mike. I'm like, motherfucker. I guess I talked for too long.
No, I was hearing. Did you guys hear that like Indian music playing?
Yeah,
really.
That's not for me, bro. Why the fuck did you guess that it's for me?
I was just muting every person, trying to see if I could make it go away, and then I did the first person, and I couldn't figure out how to undo it. So
it's the prayers. I live next to a mosque.
That was going to be my guess. Yeah.
I'm in Istanbul, so it's kind of impossible not to have the prayers like 5 times a day.
Wow.
Hey, Menno, what's it like to see a man reading a newspaper at a cafe in Marrakesh and then come up to him and just like from the side right here, like silence pistol, shoot him 3 times and then walk off like nothing ever happened? Being that you're an international spy, I imagine that's a daily occurrence for you.
Pretty much, yeah.
Sweet.
Depends on what newspaper they're reading.
Right. If it's like the journal Science, you're like, oh, all right, geez, this is a good guy.
This guy's all right.
Oz Quarterly.
Something I did want to actually address is probably with Eric. I think you'd be someone really good to talk about this. Is that I think there's a lot of people that seek optimal and they want that optimal thing. And I know you've spoken a lot about this. Do you have clients who kind of want optimal and you kind of have to be like we can't, like you can only do what you can do, and they haven't got these things outlined. Maybe they can't do the frequency that they potentially would provide them better gains, but they just can't actually do it within their lifestyle. And how do you address that with them? And are they then not getting results because they can't be quote unquote optimal, or is it still like they can still get to where they want to go?
Yeah, the optimal conversation is one I have with most neurotic late teen, early 20 lifters, at least once a week, who are my clients. And that normally starts off with just kind of me asking them questions about like basic logic. Like, okay, so what's your schedule and what can you do? And then they outline that. And then I go, now what do you want to do? And then when there's like a basic mismatch, I go, so can we focus on what we can do instead of kind of always looking at the kind of the other side of the fence, the whole grass is greener thing. A lot of the times, I try to trace it back to what's their motivation for wanting optimal. And it's like, we all have the baseline motivation of, I want to get the best progress I can. Like no one's going to disagree with that. You don't sit down with a bunch of people who want to be competitive bodybuilders and powerlifters, and they go, actually, I'm looking for average gains. Please don't make me get any stronger or bigger faster than that. No one's like that. It's more when you get someone who is super, super like, I want optimal. It's very much this fear-based, neurotic kind of constant searching and fear that they're doing something wrong, or that if they start and they don't do it right, there'll be some problem. Like a fear of missing out. It very much seems like it's consistent kind of neurotic pattern to me that I run into. Where someone, I'll even see it on social media sometimes, I'll be asked for like the same question in different ways. They're trying to get me to say exactly what they want for like 2 months. And the whole time I'm thinking, what are you doing in the gym right now during these 2 months where you're trying to run down exactly how you should deload, because like, are you just not training or is it just like, are you in the gym like, this is a waste of time because I don't have the optimal deload from Helms? Like, I don't know. So a lot of times that discussion is just getting them to understand that logically you can only do what you can do. And optimal is kind of this pie in the sky idea, but nothing exists outside of what is actually going to happen in the practical realm. So I always start from what can we do? And then I optimize that, which I think is a better way to do it. And depending on the individual, the freedom they have in their life, their commitment and their goals, and what makes sense in the long run, the proximity between what's practical and what's optimal can get closer because they are willing to make changes to their lifestyle that will support more of what we think might be optimal. I think a good savvy coach is someone who can help a client realize that sometimes the alterations they're making in their life to be optimal in the short run might have a cost that could lead them to being burned out in the long run. So for example, if a competitor is quite good at the pro level and has a chance to place on the podium, let's say at WNBF World or something like that, and therefore wants to compete every year to get as many, to get as much out of the career as possible, that could be seen as that's what's optimal. I'm getting, top 3 at Worlds. I need to be back on stage next year so I can defend that title or win that title if I'm in second or what have you. But they might not actually be able to sustain that because of the demands of prep and then the recovery period. And they might not actually be able to progress because they don't have a long enough off season. So it's one of those things that's like, look, here's reality. If you want to make significant enough physique changes, we need to take a couple of years off. That does mean missing out on placing, second or third for a couple of years, but it might result in you placing first in the long run. So a lot of the times it's discussion, not only of just practicality versus optimality, but also about career versus immediate goals and trying to get them to line up a little better. And this is something that gets progressively easier conversation to have as someone gains more experience because they also gain perspective. But it is a difficult conversation to have with, say, someone who is a talented lifter who's young. Overall, I think that's where coaching comes in, or just taking a step back if you're working with yourself and looking realistically at like, okay, what are my resources and what can I do with them versus externally what's supposedly optimal. And then I'm going to do that. Wait, I can't do that. And then just focus on that all over and over and over and over again. So I think it's also important to know that optimal is a moving target constantly. It's going to be with underneath the conditions at where you are at in your life. Like if you're injured, this is one that's really obvious. People who train through injury and do things that will make their injury worse or prolong recovery, they're trying to do something that's optimal because they're denying reality and making the situation worse for themselves. I think that's a very obvious example, but there's microcosms of that like everywhere. People often don't realize that they're sacrificing something for something else, like the example that Mike gave. I think when people wake up in the middle of the night to get a protein serving, I think that's probably not a trade-off that's worth it, considering the importance we see of sleep and the we see of protein timing. So stuff like that, I think, is where people often get hung up. And that's why I often, like, my career is kind of defined by giving people priorities and hierarchies so that they don't sacrifice one thing for another, because that's super, super common. It's kind of like, you have to remember that when you gamble on something that could be better, that might actually be a gamble. You might actually lose out because it costs something else. So it's just thinking of second and third order effects. It's thinking about practical. It's thinking about long term. So it's almost completely helping someone shift their mindset so that they can get a better perspective on what makes sense for them to be doing. And now I'm done.
Cool. I do actually have, if Menno didn't have anything there, I thought he did, but I did have something I wanted to get your guys' opinions on, actually, and it's related to what you were just talking about there, Eric. And I think because of the day and age where we have, you guys on a podcast regularly giving out amazing information, people who are savvy and they know what they're doing, they kind of know how to train, they know the basics of training and nutrition. There's your ebooks out there, there's amazing resources now. Do you think there's maybe a case, I don't know if you've seen it at all within the fitness realm, and I guess it's something that has been apparent all the time, really, where there are maybe coaches or people who are kind of preying upon those neurotic people searching optimization when you can't really get it, and kind of suggesting that you can do things with certain supplements or certain regimes that become very sexy, and it kind of takes people's eyes off the prize. I don't know if you've seen that. I think I've noticed it with maybe people suggesting that some science is maybe stronger than what it is. And, well, I guess we can say with, I don't know, someone like Charles Poliquin with genetic testing or something he might be doing. But I think it's even delving into other areas. I don't know if any of you have any experience with that or any thoughts.
I've never seen that in the fitness industry before in my life. I don't know what you're talking about. There's no deceptive marketing and people don't get preyed upon at all. So disagree.
Steve, can you feel that yet? Oh, control, enter. Can you feel that now? I've just hacked your biology through your headphones, Steve. Your muscles should be tripling in size. Isn't that how biohacking works? Like if you're interfaced with a computer? So I definitely, I do that, but that's real, so it's not a ripoff. Menno?
Yeah, he doesn't have the right USB port, I don't think.
Fuck.
You need the penis shaped one.
No, I'm the worst person to ask this question. I don't read or watch anything that doesn't have scientific references. So I have no idea of what other coaches are doing other than basically you guys, Ellen, Brad, Greg.
I think sometimes they do.
So I just realized no one answered your question seriously.
No, I mean, it's fine.
I'm going to help you out.
Please.
I'm going to help. I got you. So yes, there is a huge amount of preying on the hope for optimal, and also even understanding that individual differences exist. So you get different kinds of nonsense in the fitness industry. Sometimes you get the whole the tribalism, our solution is for everyone. That one's very easy to debunk by saying, nah, everyone's different. And I think most people intuitively get that, unless they've hook, line, and sinker. I'm a true believer of X diet, X training system, which they're out there, but it's a much easier thing to combat. The more insidious stuff is when someone says, hey, you're a special snowflake. The reason you haven't made any progress is because you don't know this one cool trick that I do. Doctors hate me. Come to me, give me all your money. I think that works on people more often because it preys on their individual frustration and their feeling that they're not part of a group. They may have tried keto or paleo or CrossFit or not that those are the only cults out there, and I don't want to make them sound bad. You can do those things more intelligently than the average, or even you've bought into the mainstream kind of 3DMJ stuff. I do 10 sets twice per week. I follow the basic meta-analytic guidelines. I haven't made progress. Now you can also be victim to someone who is taking that sales tactic. So I think that is very common, Steve, and I think it's a harder one to combat. And typically what you have to look for is the language that's being used. If it is basically giving you outcomes that they can't explain how they get them, or that can't be explained by any way. For example, you brought up Poliquin. His premise is that by measuring subcutaneous fat at certain locations in your body, I can get the equivalent of a full hormone panel, and that full hormone panel can also dictate what your nutrition and training should be, and that you should always buy my supplements. That's the one hormonal panel, that's consistent for everyone, as they have the hormones for buying his supplements, which is kind of interesting. So you have to be looking out for superlatives, very salesy language, clickbaity titles, all that stuff. And that's a tougher one to arm people against as far as detecting that BS. And it does prey on their desire for breaking a plateau, which I think is really common. A lot of the times this also works on people who are not quite yet committed to fitness, and they're hoping for some shortcut. So they're not at that place where they're at the stage of motivation where they're ready to go all in and just say, I want to do whatever it takes. They're kind of going, oh, is there a neat little, this is one cool trick that I could use that is neat for me. It kind of hits them from that angle as well. So yeah, very common.
Brilliant, Eric. And I know Mike had something to add to that as well.
Yeah, Eric, that last point, that there's folks not super tied into the industry yet that often fall for this kind of stuff. At RP, we sell a shitload of programs and diets to those exact folks. And we've consistently been running into, from all levels, but especially from those, a desire for hyper-individualization beyond what science can readily supply. We've had talks with potential athletes that were going to work with us. Well, do you guys do individualized plans? We're like, well, of course. They're like, okay, do you consider genetics and blood type? And we're like, oh boy, because you can't just say no, and then I think you're ignorant. You got to say, and you can't say no because that shit is bullshit, because that's insulting. It's real tough because you got to be like, well, some of that stuff's really cool. And eventually it's going to be super, super relevant. But unfortunately, based on what we've looked at, it's just not there yet. And there's some other stuff we use that's just just a bit better predicting like your body weight, activity level, stuff like that, versus blood type. Now it's an awesome idea. It's just not quite there yet. And that is a really good way to answer that, unless they've already been using the shit for a year and a half, and then they're like, so you're telling me that I've just been wasting my time? Or like, I'm not really saying that so much. Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. So it's tough, man. It's like Eric said, it's tough to compete with someone. We're usually on the side of anti-cookie cutter, but that's an easy side. If you're on the side of anti-individualization, boy, you look like a fucking cocksucker. Like, oh yeah, RP, 3DMJ, and Menno, they got all the answers. Huh? You guys don't even need any data about, what about me? What about my feelings? Like, all right. Like, we would love to get in, on Charles Poliquin's level. It just, we don't lie to people. I don't know. It's tough. It's tough.
One day we'll advance to the level where we can lie to people and get better results.
That'll be a great day.
We're just misleading everybody. We're ruining the industry. So.
I followed Charles Poliquin's advice once. I became convinced of his need for, which was a long time ago now, by the way, but the need to supplement magnesium. And I followed his dosage guideline, which is 2 grams of whatever magnesium kind he had. So I had diarrhea for about 2 weeks.
I was waiting for that punchline. Yeah.
Fuck.
And I actually, something to kind of wrap it up a little bit potentially, something that really resonated with me that Eric said on, I can't remember when, it might have been an interview individually, but it was about supplements. And I think something that does come out a lot is kind of new supplements, and you have like research about supplements, and something very refreshing, even I know all of you guys will agree with, is that kind of there has to be a lot of evidence before you might suggest someone takes a supplement. And even like there could be small amounts of studies coming out and people are like jumping on different supplements because they're potentially providing 1% or whatever it might be of that optimal kind of like pie in the sky. And the thing that rung true with me with that Eric said was there's so little evidence that there could potentially be a load of bad evidence that could potentially come out. And so it actually could be detrimental in the long run to think, oh, I might be getting this 1%. You actually might be getting this detriment of whatever percent we don't even know about yet. So I just wanted to bring that up because I see a lot of people, probably listeners of the podcast, who get very kind of interested. I think one of the supplements out at the moment is like CBD oil. I'm sure all of you have seen it recently.
Yeah, there's actually a very rational reason to be more skeptical of scientific research about supplements than other realms. Because, if there's one study about a certain training technique and it's promising and there's no reason to believe it's harmful, then it's something to consider, because I think a lot of people underestimate the strength of a proper scientific study. Because it's probability wise, it's actually the chance of a type 1 error is really small, and it's usually lack of statistical power, null findings that are a common problem in exercise science. So a lot of stuff finds that things don't matter, where in reality they do matter, but they are overshadowed by the massive genetic variation, and because people don't stick to their diet and don't sleep or whatever, that completely cancels out the effect of that actual training effect. But for supplements, this is basically how it usually works. So people have a new substance, they start trialing it out on rodents and whatnot, and once there's promising research, human trials follow. And if we see promising research, there will be people who, from pharmaceutical industry, supplement industry, who will fund and sponsor research about it to see if it actually works. If there is promising research, but there is no follow-up with research that actually shows, hey, longitudinally, 3 months, we got strength trainees to find out this shit actually works, it's probably because that research has actually been done but not published. Because that is the most, many people think in terms of publication bias, they think people fraud the data. And it's not always Wilson style. So usually it's the case that when people, or supplement industry, they have then the right to not publish. Because it's actually quite hard to find a scientific researcher and just tell them, okay, you're going to pretend to do this study, we're going to just give you the data, you're going to publish that, and fuck your reputation up for the rest of your life. And we're not going to give you that much money for it, really, not nearly as much as you would get in salary for being a full-time professor for the rest of your career. But this is how it's going to be. So what usually is the case is they pay them money to do the study, and then they have the right not to publish that study if the results don't agree with it. So it's very often the case that there is actually research, but it wasn't positive. So for supplements, it wasn't published. So for supplements, you need to be very, very, basically an extra level of skepticism in terms of the scientific research.
Supplements are one area where you don't want to be an early adopter. At best, if it doesn't work and you're just wasting money, but it could be actually a detrimental effect in some cases. So,
like D-aspartic acid.
Yep, that's the example I always like to use. So,
can you guys expand on that example?
Yeah. So, D-aspartic acid in 2009, I believe the first study came out. It was on males not training. Just taking it, and they saw about a 30% increase in testosterone production. And this was the only,
males, right?
I think they were just guys. I think they're just dudes. They might have been on the lower end. I don't think they were infertile. I could be wrong. And the internet completely jumped all over it, and everybody was putting it. It became a common ingredient in test boosters. Most people I know tried it. The crazy thing is there's not a single other human study done. Is the only one. And I was like, we should probably just wait a little bit. Then I think Willoughby came out with a study a few years later, testing it on resistance training males, and they found it didn't increase strength or hypertrophy. And everyone was like, oh, well, we tried and no big deal. And then a few years after that, a study came out where it actually decreased testosterone in the males taking it. So now we don't know. Does it have null effects, positive effects, or negative effects? I don't know, but I sure as hell don't want to play a 1/3 gamble on it actually being beneficial, especially when the likelihood of it actually resulting in benefits in strength training is probably low, even if you do get the change. So that's the example I like to use.
Yeah, and I think there's good rodent data showing it's actually toxic for the testes if you are not hypogonadal.
Yeah.
One to avoid, Mike.
Nah, my testes are out of the equation.
Perfect. I don't know if any of you have anything more to say on that, but I thought that was a really nice kind of interesting kind of thoughts on individualization. I think some key takeaways would be the thought of kind of starting the baseline with the science and what you guys are suggesting. And like all of you give out, there's ranges within there. You kind of start with the lower end of those, see what's working, what's not, be aware of your environment. And I think the tools of auto-regulation and like the reps in reserve, the RPE, that sort of stuff, the thoughts about kind of progressing volumes via feedback, I think that's all essential information for people to really think about. And obviously sleep was huge, and be skeptical of supplements and don't kind of be too drawn towards people who are maybe, be very skeptical as always. I think anyone listens to this podcast, just always take a second guess at things, never just take someone's word for it.
The only thing I would want to add to our discussion is that the genetic side of individual variation is not simply within the realm of physiology. I think biomechanics also plays a huge role in individualization. Your height, your limb lengths, your total body mass. We've got good data to show that all of those can also influence how you should train. Certain levers really don't predispose themselves towards safe, effective, long-term training without injury to certain movements. We've seen in some studies we've done that individuals who are very high in body mass and higher in height get less reps at a given percentage of 1RM. And anecdotally, if you talk to most powerlifting coaches who work with a spectrum of athletes across weight classes, you'll see that they have to do different things with volume and frequency at the extreme ends of that spectrum. So some of it just does come down to not just if we did a little biopsy of your muscle, what does that tell us, but also just the actual structure of your body. And I think that's something that should not be taken lightly. I think we talked about that a fair bit in the exercise selection roundtable. So just something to consider as well.
Why I didn't bring it up, Eric? No, I'm joking. That's a good point. And yeah, definitely that will come out before this. And yeah, if you haven't heard that, then definitely listen back to it. And I actually can't remember exactly what was touched on, but I know it did come up and I know you guys all destroyed it. So yeah, brilliant. I want to thank you all for coming on again. I know the listeners love these. I absolutely love them. I hope you guys enjoy talking to each other, and I will catch all of you guys and all of the listeners soon.